Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this online event that is being organized by the Enhanced Integrated Framework, EIF, of the WTO, together with the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, and the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. My name is Salimul Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, and I've been asked to moderate this discussion, and it's got my great pleasure to do that. So let me start by giving a bit of an introduction to what this is all about, and then I'll explain the procedures that we will follow in terms of presentations and discussions. So we are now in the period, the next decade is crucial. Not only must we deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but we must also halve greenhouse gas emissions relative to 2010 levels in the same period. So securing climate compatible development is not only going to be possible, but only through aligning climate and trade policy in a way that works most for the most vulnerable countries, and in particular, the least developed countries with whom I've been working for many years. So this event is part of the Aligning Climate and Trade Policy for LDCs and graduates from LDCs together by these three entities that I mentioned, the Enhanced Integrated Framework of the World Trade Organization, ODI, and IIED. And it's part of securing climate compatible trade for the most vulnerable countries. The way we will conduct this meeting is that we will have a opening remarks from Dr. Ratnakar Adhikari from the an EIF in the WTO. And then we will have a presentation on the work that has already been done jointly by ODI and IIED, presented by Dr. Jody Keane and Laura Kelly from the respectively from ODI and IIED. And then we have a couple of distinguished discussants, Mr. Rolf Traeger and Mr. Talha Muhammad, who will give their reflections. And then we shall have some time for Q&A from the audience. The format for Q&A will be through the Q&A function. So if you have questions, please put them in there. They will be relayed to me, and I will then invite one of the speakers to respond to your questions. We do have French translation, so we have both English and French. Feel free to use whichever language is convenient for you. And we look forward to having a very interesting discussion on this very important topic that we all are going to have to face. So before I invite Dr. Ratnakar Adhikari to give his opening remarks, let me just say a few things from my side. I've been working in the field of climate change, particularly impacts of climate change in the most vulnerable communities, in the most vulnerable countries for practically the last 30 years, as climate change has become a bigger and bigger reality. And I feel now, and I'm actually speaking from Glasgow, where I've just arrived a few days before the COP, and it's extremely heavy rainfall and flooding going around here in Glasgow. So climate change has actually arrived in Glasgow before the COP is even starting. And that is a reality that the whole world is going to have to face. So trade, WTO, national development, everything now has to take climate change into account. Climate change is not a separate box that other people deal with. Everybody's going to have to deal with it and learn about it, figure out what to do about it, and everything in future, every investment, every activity will have to take climate into account, both reducing emissions that cause the problem, as well as dealing with the impacts, adverse impacts, which are now a reality everywhere, but particularly in the least developed countries, particularly in the most vulnerable countries. So for the most vulnerable countries, it's a double whammy. They have to deal with development, getting out of poverty, at the same time as dealing with these climate impacts that are getting worse. So I'm very pleased to be associated, although I wasn't part of the study, but in this event with this effort jointly done by EIF, WTO, and ODI and IID. And I'm looking forward to a good discussion, and particularly out of the discussion, some ideas about how we can go forward. Where do we go from here in terms of making these two paths work together and not run on parallel tracks in future. So with that, it's my great pleasure to invite Dr. Ratnakar Adhikari from the EIF at the WTO to give us some opening remarks. Dr. Adhikari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Haq. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you and the participants wherever you are participating from. And I would like to join you, Salim, in welcoming all the panelists and participants to this event. As we all know, the world's least developed countries, LDCs, contribute insignificant amount of carbon into the atmosphere. However, their populations stand to be hit the hardest due to climate change. The LDCs increasingly need to adjust trade and industry towards greener but often complex market access measures. This is not easy for those that lack the required investment, skills, and infrastructure to catalyze green transformation. One of the means through which this can be done by building capacity of LDCs, for which Aid for Trade has been making significant contribution. Although there is a significant overlap between Aid for Trade and climate finance to help the LDCs to navigate through these challenges, this potential is yet to be fully harnessed. I would like to make two key points today, focusing on how the LDCs can harness this potential. The first point relates to the power of Aid for Trade to complement climate finance. Aid for Trade is well-established international support mechanism for LDCs. Between 2006 and 2019, Aid for Trade worth $400 billion has been dispersed, of which the LDC received close to 30%. The ODI and IIED research, which will be presented today, shows that developed countries' commitment to climate finance have fallen short of the Paris Agreement target of $100 billion per year by 2020. There are often challenges in accessing climate finance, which can be gleaned from the United Nations estimates that LDCs, even after recent increase in the recent past, have received only 14%. Just to make a comparison between the Aid for Trade, 30%, climate finance, 14%. Much more can be done to ensure that Aid for Trade plays a greater role in helping the LDCs to transition to low carbon economies and to strengthen synergies with climate finance. The LDCs are updating their nationally determined contribution for climate change. There is increasing recognition that many of the recommendations in these NDCs can also mirror Aid for Trade goals in the areas relating to, for example, agriculture, forestry, extractive, renewable energy, clean transport, etc. Furthermore, there is an increasing awareness that trade policy priorities can also have a meaningful impact on carbon reduction measures and the promotion of climate-related technological advances in the LDCs. To this end, closer partnership between trade and climate change partners would be immensely helpful. And that brings me to the second point, which relates to what the EIF has been doing and what more can be done together with this partnership that we have built. In the recent past, the EIF, which is the only Aid for Trade program dedicated to the LDCs, has adopted a more targeted approach to embedding environmental issues. Every EIF country undertakes a periodic assessment of trade opportunities and challenges through Diagnostic Trade Integration Studies, DTIS for short. These studies provide a comprehensive analysis of trade environment and offer a platform for the integration of priority issues into government policies and donor programming. Several country studies already include environmental and climate-related issues in their analysis. The DTIS for Tuvalu, facing the dramatic consequences of climate change in the Pacific region, devotes over a quarter of the entire analysis to exploring this topic and the implication for trade. The EIF's new DTIS guidelines now include environment as a cross-cutting issue to be systematically analyzed in all these studies. More recently, stemming from the launch of the Trade and Climate Change Nexus report in September 2021, World Bank and EIF have planned to work together to strengthen the DTIS guidelines, reflecting climate change issues. Similarly, the findings of the analysis conducted by ODI and IIED will immediately inform ongoing and future LDCs DTISs to better tackle the nexus between trade and climate-related policies. At the country level, the EIF works with the LDCs to build the resilience of these countries facing direct impact of climate change and the resulting desertification and extreme weather events. We have supported such initiatives in LDCs such as Lesotho, Mali, and Vanuatu, and are now working in Ethiopia and Timor-Leste. The EIF provides the LDCs with other support windows such as feasibility studies to explore the technical feasibility and economic viability of climate-related projects that also address LDC's supply-side constraints. An example could be exploring the possibility of accessing the viability of installing solar plants at a scale in a power deficit LDC such as Bangladesh. The EIF also provides the LDCs with project preparation grant that can be used to develop bankable projects, which could help the LDCs to access climate finance. Furthermore, the EIF can also provide catalytic funding to help, for example, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through trade facilitation projects that help to shorten the waiting time at the border and prevent the waste of perishable agriculture products. Strengthen green, climate-smart value chains and facilitate the import of climate-friendly technologies. The research to be presented today will certainly show us some pathways towards the opportunities that lies ahead for the LDCs in a green, climate-sensitive trading environment. We look forward to learning more to explore how the EIF can move quickly to support this transition. I wish you productive deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ratnakar Adhikari, for those excellent remarks. Before I move on and give the floor to the next two speakers, let me just share a couple of thoughts from my side in response to your excellent thoughts. Firstly, I'm not a trade expert, so please forgive me if I don't have all the details right. But one of the areas that is of particular interest to me is on sharing knowledge across borders. And that is actually a trade as well. You know, consulting companies make money out of providing knowledge to companies, to countries. And when it comes to adaptation to climate change in particular, there is actually a potential possibility of some LDCs, and in particular my country, Bangladesh, to share our knowledge with other countries. We don't necessarily need other countries coming up and telling us what to do. We can in fact help them. And as I mentioned, I'm here in Scotland right now, which is being flooded by rains. In Bangladesh, we get flooded all the time, and we are well adapted to that, and we can help Scotland and England adapt to the impacts of climate change as well. So it isn't a one-way street in terms of rich countries helping poor countries. It is actually a two-way street in which poor countries can actually help rich countries adapt to the impacts of climate change, which they're not ready to do, by the way. They are not capacitated to do that, as we saw with the recent floods in Germany killing 200 German citizens. That doesn't happen in Bangladesh anymore. We don't die from floods. And so that's an area I'd be very interested in exploring with you later. How do we make knowledge exchange south-south and even south to north as part of the larger framing of climate change and trade going forward? So thank you very much, Dr. Adhikari, for those remarks. Let us now move on to our presentations. There are two presenters who are going to present the main report that was done collectively by the two organizations that I mentioned, IID and ODI. First, we're going to have Jody Keene. Dr. Jody Keene is a senior research fellow at the International Economic Development Group of the Overseas Development Institute. And then secondly, we will have Laura Kelly, who is director of the Shaping Sustainable Markets of the International Institute for Environment and Development, IID. So over to you, Jody.
Thank you very much, moderator, for the kind introduction. And yes, as you mentioned, about halfway through the presentation, I'll be swapping over with Laura. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now. I hope you can all see that. So thank you, moderator. Thank you also to the panelists for joining us here today, and also you, the audience. And we look forward to interacting with you shortly as we get through the presentation. So today I'm just going to, the structure of the presentation really is in 4 parts. I'm just going to briefly introduce the project, the issues and the process of how we've been engaging with the LDC groups, both in terms of climate and trade. And then I'm going to pick up on some of what we consider to be the kind of the implications looking ahead to COP26 and MC12 of the research that we've undertaken. So firstly, in terms of the project, this project really was born out of a number of discussions between ODI colleagues and the IIED. Some of you may know that already there's an existing program of support that IIED leads in supporting climate change negotiators. And ODI in the trade program, we've undertaken quite a lot of support to LDCs who are graduating. So that means that they're actually exiting from the LDC status. But through our conversations, we found that, there wasn't really much, we hadn't really considered what the climate-related effects of graduation may be. So this is why we began some conversations with IIED to kind of focus and zoom in on the graduation issues. So thinking about, there's a smooth transition strategy that's being sought in relation to trade, and the LDC group is looking for an outcome on this, an agreement by all WTO members to support smooth transition strategies. But there hadn't been really much consideration within the realm of climate. And this is partly because much still remains to be agreed under the UNFCCC, in particular with regards to carbon markets and climate finance. But it's also really symptomatic of the fact, as the moderator mentioned, that trade and climate discussions, they're undertaken in kind of parallel lines. They're not really joined up. So the kind of graduation issue is really symptomatic of the need for greater alignment between trade and climate policy. So we began to kind of map out some of the links between climate change issues and trade discussions. And I've just summarized here on the slide 3 of the areas that we picked up of, in particular, issues around carbon markets, technology, and finance. So, of course, in relation to carbon markets, there's still so much that's yet to be agreed under the UNFCCC process. But when we look at conversations that are related to carbon markets, but the link isn't always explicitly made, the conversation is really dominated by border carbon adjustment measures. So we can see that there's beginning to be some discussion of these trade and climate linkages, but it's actually quite limited. So within the structured discussions on environmental sustainability, it's abbreviated to the TESSD. The discussion related to trade and climate is limited to border carbon adjustment measures at the moment. This group is a large group, so we're beginning to see momentum within the WTO around environmental and climate issues. The group is comprises around 55 countries at the moment, and there's a handful of LDCs that are taking part in those conversations currently. We then began to look at technology, the issues around technology and the commitments that have been made under the UNFCCC process, and compared and contrasted these to WTO discussions. And of course, there's been a lot of emphasis on kind of TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights flexibilities since COVID-19. And this also has issues for LDCs in terms of accessing climate change related technologies in the future. So this subject of environmental goods and services and technologies is being picked up within the structured discussions at the WTO at the moment. But we also know that those conversations have been long hampered by, what goods are on the list, what goods and services are on the lists. We've then also looked at finance, so climate finance related issues. These were picked up in some of the remarks made by Dr. Ratnakar earlier. We know that existing commitments to climate finance have not been met to date, and this really is of deep concern for LDCs. But on the other hand, we know that resources channeled through aid for trade, and in particular for LDCs through the enhanced integrated framework, these have grown, and they have a strong focus on productive capacity, strong focus on kind of infrastructure, energy, and so on. And these are often very much the sectors that are the focus, that are included within countries' nationally determined contributions as well. So clearly there's a need, there's much potential for the two mechanisms to work much more closely together. So the slide here is just to kind of point out to you, that there is some momentum at the WTO. We are beginning to see some aspects of climate change being discussed, but it doesn't yet really reflect the climate emergency that we are in. There's a need to move beyond this very narrow focus on border carbon adjustment measures to open up the conversation to focus on issues around carbon markets, carbon pricing, carbon standards, and so on. And of course, participation of LDCs in these conversations should be boosted too. So overall, we would say momentum is growing, but there's still some way to go with regards to really considering climate change effects, both the regulatory effects of climate change, as LDCs need to adapt to policy measures applied elsewhere, as well as the physical effects of climate change. As emphasized by the moderator, LDCs are going to be the hardest hit, contributed the least to the problem, and they have to essentially adopt new development models. And this is unprecedented. So looking ahead to MC12, there are still some questions as to how LDC trade and climate interests may be reflected in some of the ministerial statements that we know are forthcoming. So from the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, we know that a statement is forthcoming. We don't yet know how LDC trade and climate interests may be reflected within that. There's likely to be a statement coming also from the Committee from Trade and Environment. Again, this may be quite general and loose. We still don't know, how LDC interests will be reflected. And still, the LDC group is working hard to try and secure across all WTO members support for LDC's smooth transition from LDC status. So essentially, the group is seeking a 12-year transitional period whereby they will exit the LDC category. And this is, a reflection of their development progress, their gains in terms of increasing incomes, reducing poverty, and so on. But it's this securing a smooth transition so that they're not affected by the kind of adversely affected by the kind of quick removal of tariff preferences and so on. So it's seeking this kind of 12-year transitional period. Obviously, climate change, considering the effects of climate change increases the impetus really to secure that smooth transition. But we are yet to see whether all WTO members will agree. Bangladesh has been one of the main proponents of that proposal. And of course, Bangladesh is also one of the most climate vulnerable economies in the world. Just before I hand over to Laura, I'd also mentioned, it was mentioned earlier by Dr. Ratnakar, some of the examples of small island states, Kiribati and Tuvalu. These LDCs, they have resisted graduation. Actually, they've hit the thresholds for some time, but they have continued to resist graduation because they are concerned about exiting the strategy without there being appropriate support measures that recognize their severe, extreme environmental vulnerabilities to climate change. So these are the kind of main issues looking ahead on the trade side. And I'll now pass over to Laura for reflections on the climate side. Laura, over to you.
Great. Very good to be here today. And as Salim said, it is in Glasgow that they're seeing the impact of climate change. I'm in London at the moment, and similarly, it's pouring with rain outside, but it's also 16 Celsius. So incredibly warm for the time of year, the kind of variability that we're seeing, really highlighting the urgency of the need for progress at COP and at MC12. So Jodie, if I could have the next slide, please. Hopefully the technology is going to work. Great, thank you. The LDCs have been working really hard over the last year, chaired by Ambassador Sonam from Bhutan. IID has been working with them around their preparations, and as Salim has said, they are already in Glasgow. So these are the sorts of things that they have been working on and are pushing forward as their priority asks at the COP. We're seeing, as we've said, this need for an increase in ambition in the NDCs. Many countries have made net zero commitments, but the timeframes and the depth of those is not necessarily what we need to keep within 1.5 degrees. Another issue is the way that those are being framed, and if they are real commitments and real cuts being made, or if there is carbon sinks being introduced, tree planting and so on. So actually really seeing that the NDC commitments are meaningful and also that they are measurable and that there is transparency there. Also the need for loss and damage. This is a mechanism that was agreed within Paris for the most vulnerable countries to be compensated. Progress on that has been slow, and the review coming up at COP will be really important for those vulnerable LDCs and small island states that we've just been talking about. Jodie's already mentioned the sort of the carbon markets angle and the link to trade. Again, this is an important issue for discussion at Glasgow. It's very contentious. The EU have just put forward proposals for their carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but they haven't really consulted very broadly on that. Hopefully there is potential to explore these issues at COP and to get a greater understanding of what the implications might be for LDCs, who at the moment might not be exporting or affected by these new rules, but actually as their economies grow and they want to export more, then they could be impacted. Climate finance, this huge commitment that was made by developed countries to provide $1 billion a year by 2020. We know that that's been missed this week. The UK and others have said that it will be met in 2023, but that is just not soon enough. We've also at IID shown that the LDCs face a huge gap in financing of that 100 billion, and not a large amount has flowed to them. So they're facing a sort of nearly 100 billion a year financing gap themselves. And then the actual rules, the sort of the rules-based system, sometimes the slightly more boring and prosaic parts of both climate and trade negotiations, that actually the rules are agreed and that there is transparency on reporting, timeframes and so on. This is a really key issue to build trust in the system. Next slide, please, Jodie. So if we now think about what we've been trying to do in this joint project between ODI and IID funded by the EIF, we focused our approach to build linkages between the LDC trade and climate communities, but also to build through seminars like this and through our research projects, greater awareness of what the issues actually look like and what you might do to respond to them. We've had a series of closed meetings with the trade and climate LDCs, and it's been great to see so many participate at what is a really busy time for them in the run-up to COP and to MC12. Coming out of that, we hope will be some commitments to work together going forward for more coordination on issues that are emerging and where there are areas of overlap. And then we've produced, or we are in the process of producing, they're not actually available yet, 3 policy briefs on areas of relevant research that the 2 LDC groups said would be particularly useful for them. Climate finance and aid for trade obviously is a really key one, and considering how there's potential synergies between climate finance and aid for trade. Looking at carbon markets and standards, the kinds of issues that LDCs might want to consider as they look at how they might be impacted on things like CBAMs. And then the technology transfer issue, how to mobilise the support that is committed to in both UNF and CCC, UNFCCC and WTO agreements, sorry. And I think I'm picking up on Celine's point earlier, technology transfer isn't just about northern technologies transferred, it's also about south-south transfer, it's also about making the technologies that are available appropriate in the local situations. And if you just say a little bit about what we've found in each of these areas. Next slide, please, Jodie. So on the technology transfer one that IID has been leading on, we've actually seen that there is really potential for there to be greater synergies between the UNFCCC and WTO mechanisms. There's a lot of commitments around technical assistance provisions, provisions of finance, looking at how things are transferred in a way that is locally appropriate, building the institutional capacity to absorb technologies. Those are themes that are common between both the trade and the climate technology transfer negotiations. I'm going to hand back to Jodie now to give you a quick update on the climate finance, aid for trade and carbon markets and standards work.
Thank you very much, Laura. So yes, so within the briefings that will be publicly available soon, we've demonstrated that there is scope for aid for trade and climate finance to work more effectively together. It kind of requires both a kind of update of conceptual frameworks for the NDCs themselves so that trade is mainstreamed. And then it's kind of considering climate change effects more broadly within aid for trade programming. I think it's really important to emphasize that there's an important window of opportunity here as we approach the next Global Aid for Trade review next year, 2022. So already we know that within the discussions on greening aid for trade, which have taken place so far within the WTO structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, it's kind of moved from solely considering environmental impacts and so on to the broader, the bigger issue of climate change effects. So it's thinking about how to update those conceptual frameworks. I think also at the operational level, there may be some lessons that can be learned from the provision of aid for trade, because in the realm of climate finance, the challenges of accessing climate finance are consistently reported by LDCs. So there may be some operational, kind of at the operational level, some lessons that can be learned. And of course, donors must also improve their coordination. And often donors are providing both climate finance and aid for trade support, but they're not joined up at the moment. So there is a need for a kind of more coordinated approach and thinking smartly about how these two mechanisms can work more effectively together. It gets a bit more trickier, when you consider the issues around just transition and, helping countries move from fossil fuels to renewable energies. So in relation to carbon markets and standards, we looked at two types of carbon markets. This includes the first type, which I mentioned in relation to Article 6 of the UNFCCC, where negotiations are underway for a multilateral framework to guide baseline and credit mechanisms at the current time. And then we looked at the second type, which are the cap and trade emissions trading schemes, such as the European Union's. So yes, at the current time, it looks like there may be limited effects on LDCs from the border carbon adjustment measures, but Mozambique is really in the firing line at the current time. So it still is a cause for concern by LDCs. And as Laura mentioned, as their economies grow and diversify, more sectors may be targeted and affected in the future. And there's kind of limited scope for adaptation at the moment. Trade costs are likely to increase. How can countries mitigate these measures? I can see already in the chat box, there's a comment about, why don't LDCs apply border carbon adjustment measures themselves? Well, theoretically they could, but they would need their own emissions trade, to do what the EU is doing. They would also need their own emissions trading scheme, although that is just one way in which you can do it. But I think that's certainly looking ahead for both types of carbon markets and their different types of trade-related implications. There's a need to ensure effective carbon pricing with agreed methodologies and approaches, and we also need common carbon standards. We don't have them yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both Jodie as well as Laura, for that excellent presentation. We're very pleased to have now with us two very distinguished panelists or discussants, and I'll give them the floor each to share some reactions and views on what they've just heard. I'll introduce both of them first, and then I'll give the floor to the first and then the second. So the first panelist we have is Mr. Rolf Traeger, who is the Chief LDC section of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD. And then the second distinguished panelist is Mr. Muhammad Alim Talha, who is the Counselor, Economic and Commercial Affairs at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Chad to the UN office in Geneva, and also the LDC Group Coordinator. So first, let me come to Rolf Traeger. Mr. Traeger, as you are in the LDC section of UNCTAD, what is your reaction? Have they missed anything? Is there something there that you think needs to be added or could be added in the analysis that ODI and IID have just shared with us? Over to you, Mr. Traeger.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salim. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this very important event for inviting myself and UNCTAD to be present. Of course, the questions which are being discussed here, they are absolutely crucial to the LDCs and hence to our work on LDCs. And I think that the project which we are discussing today is a major contribution towards bringing coherence in international and multilateral policymaking, because all too often what we see is that there is a disconnect between different fora of discussions, even as they relate to development and more specifically to LDCs, whether we are talking about trade fora, finance fora, climate fora, etc., even the UN. So I think that this is a major contribution. And I think that what has been presented is a very careful research on what the issues are, but also on the way forward. And so therefore, I think it's a major contribution to policymaking and to bring this greater coherence. I would just like to add that, and of course, harking back on our own research on LDCs, and I'd like to call the attention to the importance of structural transformation of the LDC economies, because we have long argued that structural transformation is the conditio sine qua non for LDCs to meet their development targets, whether we are talking about SDGs, environmental targets, social targets, etc. And this structural transformation that we are talking about, it supposes the technological progress in all sectors of economic activity, whether we are talking about industry, about agriculture, about services, but also and critically the transfer of resources, of labor, capital, etc., to new sectors, new types of economic activities. And this is particularly crucial in terms of the green transition. And there are a number of examples which could be given here. For instance, in terms of agriculture, this is an absolutely critical sector for LDC economies. We have to think that we have 56% of the labor force working in agriculture, and this, giving the geographic location of all LDCs, whether they're coastal countries, SIDS, or landlocked countries, is a major sector which will be very directly impacted by climate change, and this is already taking place. So this is an area where you have major adaptation needs. But also another sector which is very important, which are the extractive sectors of LDCs. And here you have different scenarios. You have those countries which are heavily reliant on the extraction of oil, of carbon, of gas, and which face the risk of being heavily reliant on stranded assets. But at the same time, you also have some opportunities like the growing demand for, let's say, non-traditional type of metals like lithium, etc., which in the digital economy, the economy for them is growing much more. So, I mean, there you have opportunities. But even there, for them to take advantage of these opportunities, it's important for them not to continue on an extractivist mode of economic activity, but to move towards greater processing, towards greater capacity building in terms of technology, processing, etc., of building linkages domestically. And all of this will hopefully amount to structural transformation. So all of this means that what the LDCs need is some green industrial policy which aims to the structural transformation, to the way they produce and consume, etc. And in order to implement these green industrial policy, they need a much stronger support from the international community. And of course, in terms of implementing these policies for structural transformation, the trade policies, the climate policies, environmental policies, they have an absolutely crucial role to play, but also the support of the international community is absolutely crucial, particularly in terms of technology and finance, which we have already mentioned here, but also again in terms of the CBAM schemes which are being put in place. It's necessary to think when these schemes are further defined and put in place about the need to insert in them special and differential treatment for LDCs in these schemes. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Traeger, for some very, very thoughtful comments. I'm sure these will be picked up in the Q&A. I hope you can stick around to respond to questions as well. Now let me turn to our second panelist, who is, I've already introduced, Mr. Muhammad Alim Talha from Chad. Mr. Talha, please share your thoughts from the LDC country's perspective. What do you feel needs to be done? If you have any comments on the study, but also what you think needs to be done going forward. And let me remind everybody that we have French translation. So if you wish to listen in French or in English, you have to choose the language you wish. Mr. Talha, the floor is yours.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup, Dr. Salim. Je voudrais tout d'abord
Thank you, Dr. Salim. First of all, on behalf of the Least Developed LDCs group, I would wish to thank and congratulate the organizers for this important initiative that has allowed us to discuss and see in what way we can contribute to advancing this important issue and seeing how we can align climate and trade for LDCs. Moderator, you mentioned in your introduction an important aspect, an interesting aspect for us, especially regarding sharing of experience and good practices. This dimension is important. There are approaches, of course, from countries in the South that could be useful elsewhere. We need to draw from what has worked and see how we can scale up the efforts to correct their errors, to correct the mistakes, and avoid some of those mistakes in the LDCs. For our subject today, this afternoon, during their event on the 26th of October this week, the coordinating ambassador mentioned that the recent extreme climatic events should contribute to raising political awareness on the need to act on, global warming and climate changes, because this is an important aspect that the entire world is going to face, and the interaction between climate change and trade should be understood for us to be able to obtain concrete results. Most of the LDCs have already faced challenges in accessing markets. There are challenges in production, like Rudolph said. There's climate change in terms of physical changes on the productive structures and their regulatory structures influence the market and create new challenges. Of course, opportunities exist, and these could be harnessed, but entering new green trade, supply chains is important, and LDCs would need support to be able to adapt to this new trade environment that is going to be shaped by the main actors and their ambitions, of course. The momentum has been identified at WTO, but this momentum does not reflect the climatic emergency that we are facing at the moment. And from the LDC groups that are graduating in the next, or will be graduating in the next few years, they need to guarantee strategies, transition strategies based on supportive measures such as preferential trade measures are important, taking into climate change effects, taking into account climate change effects and developing supportive mechanisms. Today, 26 LDCs are involved in graduation measures, and 19 of those are members of the WTO. If, of course, you look at that compared to the 35 LDCs that we know of, those that are graduating from the LDC category, it would mean that the graduating country loses access to specific supportive mechanisms, especially for trade. And these measures like preferential tariffs or preferential trade regimes or differentiated trade regimes. And at the time we are facing the COVID pandemic, removing these measures, these preferential measures for these countries, leads these countries to fall into the LDC category after graduating. These risks have been identified, but no formal mechanisms at the WTO have been put in place to make a flexible transition. And the LDCs that have been adversely affected by COVID have not been supported at a time when they have also faced climate change effects. So the more secure WTO countries could help in opening up the necessary policy space for these countries to adapt. It has been clearly understood that the LDCs face major environmental and economic vulnerabilities. And since we are facing this climatic emergency, the number of LDCs that are affected by the current situation, by the difficult situation, are known, and I think it is time to start thinking about the international supportive mechanisms. There's the A4T, aid for trade, and making sure that all these measures are aligned to SDGs and adaptation mechanisms for climate change. There's export diversification as an adaptation mechanism that has to be insisted on, and we continue to insist upon it, because if we do not have that diversification approach, we will not be able to advance in this area. Of course, what remains difficult to get before the climate change, the mechanisms that we need to improve in coordination, especially on issues such as technology transfer, for us to be able to support these diversification efforts from the LDCs and be able to reduce economic and environmental vulnerabilities. These are my first thoughts concerning the approaches and the aspects that the LDCs have been working on, especially regarding the linkages between climate change and trade. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Talla. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Talla. So let me now, in the interest of time, and I see that we have quite a few good questions in the Q&A box, move to the Q&A section, and I'll invite all our speakers and panelists, Rolf, Jody, Laura, and Monsieur Talla, to stay with us, and feel free to jump in with comments and views if you wish. I might direct questions to each of you, but you're all at liberty to chip in if you wanted to do that as well. So I'm going to start with one first question that comes from Kare Johad. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is to you, Jody. He says, or she says, in your view, what needs to be done to better engage LDCs in WTO TESSD? I'm afraid I don't know what that acronym refers to. I assume you do. So far, they have been somewhat absent in discussion on, for example, EGA and a fossil fuel subsidy reform statement. Jody, do you want to take that?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's a very important question. I'm quite pleased to say that there does appear to be some progress, and so I was informed by the EIF and the WTO Secretariat that there are efforts to ensure that the structured discussion, so the TESSD is the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions. So it's the large group, around 55 countries at the moment, that are taking part in those discussions. There are efforts to bring in the LDC perspective, and I do believe that will be this will be taking place actually within the next few weeks ahead of MC12. So that is a really, really positive development. I think it always comes down to, addressing capacity constraints, and also, providing support in terms of the analytical work as well, so that LDCs who don't have the capacity to undertake that analytical work themselves can see that, there may be benefits to joining those discussions. So I think it's that kind of sensitizing and providing that, addressing those capacity constraints. Obviously, the EIF has helped to, through this kind of catalytic project that the EIF supported, we've been able to make some headway, but I do hope, that the work stream that we've begun to develop can be continued in the future. I really do. I don't know, Laura, if you had any other thoughts on that also.
Laura, okay. So thank you very much for that, Jody. Let me move on to a second question, which is from Simon Maxwell, who's had actually quite a few questions, but I'm going to pick one to start us off with. And perhaps, Laura, I might ask you to be the first respondent, and others if they wish to. The question is, does the panel have a view on how LDCs should approach trade impact issues of carbon emissions from aviation and shipping? In an ideal world, would they be champions of aggressive carbon pricing in aviation and shipping? And are there any WTO implications? Laura, any thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, I see a lot of questions from Simon. I mean, that's a really good one to pick on. I think it's quite interesting. COVID has had an impact on many global supply chains. And we've been involved in a project at IID funded by FCDO, looking at horticultural exports from East Africa, so places like Tanzania and Kenya, obviously some LDCs, which is used to being air freighted directly on the passenger flights that are going from those countries. Obviously, they stopped during COVID, or pretty much stopped. So actually, one of the projects looked at using sea freight technologies, so using different gases to slow down the ripening of fruits, to enable flowers to be packed in bud and then to be sea freighted. Now, obviously, bunker fuels aren't the cleanest, but actually the overall carbon impacts of that have been shown to be quite positive. So I think this is perhaps, it's a bit of a technology issue. It's about using new and innovative technologies to do things differently. So I think that's the kind of solutions that we need to be thinking about, rather than saying, actually, you should stop moving things around, that you actually look at how you can do things sort of in a cleaner and more inclusive way.
Rolf, would you like to come in on this, please?
Yes, I'd like to make a very short comment on following up on Laura has just said. It's the fact that some SIDS, LDCs, Tuvalu, etc., they have been pushing very strongly for carbon taxes on aviation, etc. But then you might say, well, but I mean, many of these countries, particularly the Pacific SIDS, they are dependent on tourism. So are they shooting themselves on the foot? And so it's obviously not the case. But I mean, the question is what you do with the proceeds of such taxes. And the proposal is that they should be used to finance their diversification, their transformation, etc. And I'd like just to mention another interesting example also in East Africa, which was the case of Ethiopia, in which talking about innovation, etc., during the pandemic, of course, passenger movement was almost came to nil. So Ethiopian Airlines was very deft in switching its business model towards freight cargo rather than passenger movement. So I mean, this shows how you can have innovative solutions coming from these countries and which can be shared with other countries, as was mentioned here earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rolf, for that. Let me now move on to another question, which comes from Yvette Stevens, and I'll invite Monsieur Tala perhaps to have a first go, and then other panelists if they wish to chip in. The question is, for LDCs to benefit better in global trade, they need to add value to their primary commodities and to industrialize. For these, they would require greater power supply. While realizing that the long-term costs of renewable energy compete favorably with the costs of power generation using fossil fuels, we know that the capital upfront cost of renewables might be prohibitive for LDCs. So the question then is, would climate finance provide such financing? Mr. Tala, would you like to have a go at this, and then I'll open it for the other panelists.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Modérateur. C'est une question.
Thank you, moderator. This is an interesting and important question. Certainly, we need financing to implement the projects. You mentioned the energy issue. It is important because, you know, if we do not have access to energy, we cannot develop, we cannot implement major development projects without energy. These are important issues that we have been raising in the multilateral discussion fora, especially the discussions that we have already had have raised awareness about this important issue, and we hope we are going to get the necessary financing for us to be able to implement the different projects from the LDCs. I would wish to add, you know, you usually think that, you know, in the past, LDCs thought that environment issues are not important issues for the WTO. We see today that this is an important cross-cutting issue. You cannot say that agriculture is a priority if you are not taking into account the consequences of climate change. You have floods that destroy gardens. You have floods that destroy farms. So agriculture is a priority, but you cannot consider agriculture without associating it to climate change. You cannot say that it is important to negotiate fishing rights if you are not taking into account the impact of over-exploitation of the fish resources that we have and protecting the endangered fish species. On goods and other services. There are several examples that we could raise. This is why it is important. There is the issue that has been raised here that is important. If we do not have the necessary means, we cannot achieve these objectives. So the financing aspect is critical, and we need to find ways of presenting these needs and priorities at the formal organs, and we need the financing for these. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tala. Any other comments from any of the other panelists? Jody, please go ahead, and then Rolf, if you wish to.
Yes, so I think this is the kind of the question really gets to the heart of the problem with regards to climate finance, and this is precisely why we need agreement on Article 6 as well. So this would help to secure the future of the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which is precisely the sort of mechanism that would enable developing countries to make those decisions. So investing in projects that can provide emissions reductions, essentially. So you're not going for a fossil fuel strategy, you're going for a clean renewable energy strategy. And the Sustainable Development Mechanism, in theory, should help leverage the climate finance to assist in making those sorts of decisions. So that's why these discussions at COP26 are really, really so important. Just briefly looking at the kind of alignment between African recovery strategies and the Green Recovery Action Plan for Africa, and we can see that renewable energy, there really is a need for a lot more work on renewable energy to ensure greater alignment between recovery strategies and this Green Recovery Action Plan for Africa, which also includes within it a specific pillar on climate finance also. So absolutely key. It really is a very good question.
Thank you very much. Rolf, did you want to come in?
Yes, very shortly. Concerning this issue on energy availability, access to energy and industrialization, I mean, we dedicated the LDC report 2017 exactly to energy issues. And there, what we saw is that still you have almost 60% of energy supply on average in LDCs comes from traditional biomass. So that's a lot of work to do towards renewable energy, etc., etc. So the investment requirements are enormous. So how do you justify them? Well, the only way to make, in a sense, ends meet is to put energy policy together with policies for structural transformation, because the whole point is to have some form of industrialization and diversification, which generates a mass of companies, of commercial users of energy, which have a higher capacity to pay for modern energy, which then can allow also some sort of subsidization of energy for the poor population. But for this, you need to have the transformational policies in place, which bring in place new forms of activity, new sectors of activity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolf. We are coming towards the end of our time, but let me take another question. In fact, this is for you, Rolf, as well. It's from Simon Maxwell, who asks makes a comment and then asks a question. He says, good points about a green industrial revolution in LDCs. Would you also want to see protection of domestic industries to make that possible? And would such policies be WTO compatible? Rolf, tricky question.
Yeah, well, okay, it's definitely a very tricky question. Well, the point is that the issue of doing infant industry protection, etc., or whatever form of protection for industrialization is not a black or white issue. It's not either you do it or you don't. There are all sorts of different mechanisms through which you can do this. And so something that we have been pushing for is a strong emphasis not just in domestic markets, but in regional markets. So you have some new initiatives like the AFCFTA, etc., which do provide scope for the development of transformative projects in terms of infrastructure, in terms of industrialization, with the aim of serving regional markets, particularly through the transformation of raw materials, of agricultural raw materials, metals, etc., etc. So I think that probably some light form of protectionism applied very smartly on a temporary basis, probably this will be required. I mean, of course, it has to be compatible with international trade commitments, WTO, etc. But it's very important that it's applied in a smart way and with the famous reciprocal requirements of industrial policy, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolf. So as I said, we are coming towards the end, and I would like to wrap up by giving each of you a minute each to share some thoughts. And I see Monsieur Talla has his hand up, so I'll give the floor first to Monsieur Talla, and maybe we'll go in reverse order for the final concluding remarks. And just some reflections, and I'd like you to think a little bit about what next? Where do we go from here? What do you think should be priorities for us to continue this type of conversation, this type of discussion, bringing together the two strands of climate and trade in the least developed countries in particular? Monsieur Talla, you have the first intervention.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Salim.
Thank you, Dr. Salim. Would simply, in order to conclude, say that the LDCs have contributed the least to the climate change. However, they are confronted to the extreme vulnerabilities. Most least developed countries are going through a lot of natural catastrophes, natural things such as Bangladesh and others. According to specialists, such episodes are only increasing, and they are going to increase in years to come. That's why it's very important that whenever we talk of trade, we need to consider aspects linked to adaptation, climate adaptation, as well as mitigation. This is extremely important. These are pertinent issues for LDCs. Such discussions, like what we are doing now, contribute in creating dynamics in of course, COP26, the perspective of the 12th ministerial conference that we are going to have in a few weeks. And such discussions should continue even beyond, both for negotiations, but also for programming in the perspective of some world consideration of financing trade. We are aware that trade is, of course, a means to an end, but it's indispensable to make it in such a way that trade will ensure protection of a clean environment. And of
I'm
course,
afraid you're cutting out.
A stake.
I can't hear. Can others hear?
Yes. Je termine simplement. Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez.
I do not know if you can hear me, but allow me to conclude.
We can, yes.
I'll conclude by saying that what we are looking at will contribute to preservation of the environment and improving the linkages between trade and climate change. And once again, I would like to reiterate our thanks, our gratitude to the organizers of this event. An interesting event for us, and we hope that such events are going to be organized once again in future for us to be able to understand the stakes regarding climate change and trade. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Tala. And I think this is the start of a conversation, not the end of these discussions by far. Rolf, over to you for some last thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Salim. Well, I think that there has been a lot of talk these days as we approach COP26 about raising ambitions, that countries need to increase ambitions, raise ambitions, etc., etc. This, of course, applies particularly to the greatest emitters, and of course, the LDCs are the smallest emitters. But I think that by the same token, just like we have to raise ambitions in climatic and environmental terms, there's a very stringent need to raise ambitions in terms of providing LDCs with the means of implementations, in terms of their development agenda, of their climate agenda, etc. And here again, I'd like to plead again for raising ambitions in terms of finance, which is made available to LDCs, climate finance, but also other forms of finance, ODA and otherwise, but also in terms of technology transfer. I mean, the technology transfer, in a sense, it's all over the place. It's in the UNFCCC, it's in the TRIPS agreement, etc. It will pop up in the new plan of action of LDCs, but I mean, unfortunately, very little actual action has been taken there. And I agree with what has been said here, that it has to go in all directions, north-south, south-south, also south-north. But I mean, there are international commitments for north-south transfer. There are different ways in which this can be done. And there are much more positive action has to be taken in this direction.
Thank you.
And I finish my remarks here by thanking the organizers once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolf. And thank you for taking the time to be with us and share your thoughts. I'll give a minute each to Laura and Jody to give us some thoughts on what next. Laura?
Thank you, Salim, and I'll be very brief. Yes, thank you also to Rolf for spending time and joining us, and for Mr. Tala giving us the LDC perspective. I think the LDCs have shown real leadership in engaging with this process and starting to look at how the linkages could be made. So I would simply say that we, as the LDC partners, be it research organisations like IID and ODI, international institutions such as UNCTAD, donors, the World Bank, financial institutions, that we should look to see how we can support this going forward, both through the financial kinds of commitments that we've talked about and also through the policy dialogues. So as you say, hopefully this is the start of the conversation.
Thank you. Jody, some last words?
Yes, thank you. So I would say to everyone, stay tuned, because next week we will be screening our high-level event with opening remarks from the WTO DG. And within those remarks, you will really see, her great commitment to ensuring that the LDC's voice is heard in relation to trade and climate. So in that respect, given the new leadership, there is room for optimism, that we can move between simply kind of observing the UNFCCC, observing the WTO, and towards, a more integrated and coordinated approach that's more in line with the SDGs, SDG goal 17. And of course, the next COP will be in Africa, which is where most LDCs are located. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So it remains for me to just wrap up. I'm going to share a few thoughts of my own on what I've heard and what I think we might be able to do together going forward. And then I will thank everybody and close the meeting. So let me start by saying that I have a long history with the LDCs in the climate change arena. In fact, I used to be at IID for many years when I started this work. And I was instrumental in getting the least developed countries to form a group in the UN Framework Convention. They didn't exist as a group from the beginning. They only formed a group around COP6 and COP7. And ever since then, I have been assisting and advising them in the climate change arena. But again, as I said, we are very siloed. We just do climate change. We don't do trade. We don't know anything about trade. And we need to learn. We need to link the two. And even within the national delegations, the people who come to the COPs aren't the trade people. So we don't really know much about that. And similarly, people who go to WTO are not the climate people. So we need a better connection within the countries themselves and also at the global level in these various discussions, which are no longer separate tracks. They have to be synergized to a very great degree, global to national to even local. And I do believe we can do that. Just one personal comment in response to the conversations just we had and the question from Simon Maxwell on the international air passenger levy. There is actually an LDC proposal that goes way back to the Poznan COP. I was very much involved in it, for an international air passenger levy to be given for adaptation funding at that time. It was quite well debated within the LDC group, and these issues of whether it was going to be cost effective or negative impacts on some of the island states that are dependent on tourism. And we discussed and analyzed that, and we found that a $5 levy on an international flight does not make a difference on whether somebody is going to fly to Tuvalu or Maldives for a holiday or not. $5 does not make a difference in their decision on a $1,000 or $1,500 flight. On the other hand, we also agreed in the LDC group that this should not be exclusively just for rich countries. All countries, including LDCs, if they can afford to fly on an international flight, let's say between Nairobi and Kampala, they can afford the $5 extra to provide into this adaptation fund. So it was a well thought out proposal. It never made much headway in the COP itself. Other countries were not very happy. It never got moved forward, but it never died either. The proposal is still on the table. It's the least developed country proposal for an international air passenger levy for adaptation at that time. In fact, there's talk now reviving it, not just for adaptation, but for loss and damage, which is now a reality. And air passengers are polluters who are causing loss and damage. And therefore, it would be an application of the polluter pay principle if we were to take it forward and get it adopted. So something, food for thought for the researchers in this group to think about. If you think it might be worth reviving or having another look at it, I'd be very interested in exploring that myself as well. So it remains for me to thank all the speakers who are with us here today. Thank you very much for giving your time. All the audience and the questioners for the questions, and to EIF for funding this work, and ODI and IID for doing an excellent study. And the results of the study, I understand, will be available on the website which has been put up in the Q&A chat box for everybody to access later on. So with that, let me conclude and thank everybody for being with us here today. Thank you very much, and wishing you a good rest of the day and coming 2 weeks. And particularly for anybody coming to Glasgow, please look me up. We can have a cup of coffee together. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Salim. Bye-bye, everyone.